Hey everyone, this is Amar from Toronto.
And this is Erin, and welcome to another episode of Das Criminal Podcast.
And happy summer. Hope you're enjoying your post-summer solstice weather.
So, what are we up to today, Amar?
So we're going to be discussing the neo-Nazi murder of Mulugeta Seraw. And to start, I think there should be a content warning where this is part of a series of episodes we're doing on violence against Black people in the United States. So you've probably gleaned from the title that there will be neo-Nazis involved, which means there'll be mentions of racism and anti-Semitism in one of its most violent forms. So please do listen with discretion.
Yeah, but we think it's an important story to tell and one that we want to discuss with you.
Yeah, so without further ado,
let's begin. On the night of November 12, 1988, Mulugeta Seraw and two of his friends, Tilahun Antna and Wanwosen Tesfaye, pulled up to Mulugeta's apartment complex in Portland, Oregon. The three were returning from a party at Lion's Restaurant, a joyful night out with friends.
Now, the street outside Mulugeta's apartment, Pine Terrace Apartments, where he lived at the time, were already loaded with cars. So Tilahan and Wandosen decided to remain in the road while dropping off Mulugeta instead of parking in the street.
Another car with three couples inside, 6 passengers total, pulls up, and the people inside ask Mulugeta's friends to move. Mulugeta decides to say goodnight and go inside on his own. But as he approaches his door, he hears the passengers of the other car shouting racial slurs at Tilahun and Wanwosen. The altercation quickly turns physical, and Mulugeta, known to be gentle and kind, goes back to try and break up the fight. The men from the other car beat Mulugeta to the ground with a baseball bat. As Mulugeta struggled to stand back up, they kicked him with their steel-toed boots. Tilahun and Wanwosen were able to escape, but Mulugeta never got up again. At just 28 years old, he was murdered in a case that would shock Portland and bring to light the horrific underbelly of present-day neo-Nazis in the United States.
It would shock Portland, maybe, but I don't know if it would shock the state of Oregon, because from what I've read, there seems to be a very active presence of white nationalists and neo-Nazis across the rural Pacific Northwest. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yeah, we're definitely going to get into the nitty-gritty of white nationalism, but it's been a thing in the Pacific Northwest for a while. This was in 1988, so it was before the internet, and organizing a gang of neo-fascists was much easier done at the local level, but we're going to talk about how these people came together. So let's start our conversation with a discussion of Mulugeta, the victim. Mulugeta Seraw was born in a small farming town in Ethiopia's Gandor province in 1960 to parents Fetenek Berhanu and Seraw Tekuna. Like many in East Africa, he took his father's name as his surname. According to writer Eleanor Langer in her book on this case, 100 Little Hitlers, Mulugeta was a bright child and excelled in his education.
Even as an adult, Mulugeta was unimposing. He only weighed about 100 pounds, 45 kilograms, or a little over 7 stone. So, I could definitely have squatted him, benched him, and deadlifted him. When Mulugeta had exhausted his educational opportunities in his hometown, he moved in with relatives in the country's capital, Addis Ababa, to continue his schooling. There, at some point, he fathered a son, Henek, with a young woman in Ethiopia. But unlike Mulugeta's hometown, Addis Ababa was the center of Ethiopia's many conflicts. And Mulugeta soon decided it would be best if he joined his uncle, whose name is Engada, on the west coast of the United States to continue his education.
In November of 1980, then 20-year-old Mulugeta left his family in Ethiopia behind to move in with Engada near Portland, Oregon. This case especially hits close to home because Mulugeta is similar in so many ways to you, Amar. He left his home country to pursue a university degree and a better life in the West.
Yeah, it's really depressing researching it because when I came to Toronto, I didn't know a single person here. In terms of physical distance, the closest people I knew were my high school friends, and one was in Montreal, one was in Buffalo, and one was in Boston. It was very daunting, but to me, I really wanted to do it, both in terms, like you said, to pursue a university degree and a better life, but also to start over, get a fresh start. And I always have to continuously remind myself how lucky I am to have the luxury of moving when, like, in terms of both material benefits and the fact that I'm a boy, a son, when many others back home cannot for a myriad of reasons.
Yeah, Mulugeta's story really sounds like such a universal immigrant experience, like coming to the United States, looking for a better education, for a better life. Maybe he eventually had some plans to bring his son here. In the US, Mulugeta took different jobs. He was a fast food worker, a custodian at an elementary school, a bus driver for an airport rental car company, and he put himself through school and sent money back home to his son, Henek. He slowly worked toward his degree and connected with other Ethiopians living in the area. Though they were a small community, Portland's Ethiopian diaspora was close, helping one another when they were in need and enjoying social gatherings like the one at, I said before, Lyon's restaurant. I think it's Lyon's restaurant, like Lyon in France.
Yeah, I feel like it's Leon.
Apologies to our French listeners. At Lyon's restaurant, the night when he died.
On the night that he died, that Saturday night in November of 1988, Mulugeta and two of his friends, Tilahan and Wandwosen, had hung out at Mulugeta's flat for a while before heading to the restaurant. At the party, they socialized with friends, enjoyed the food, the beverages, before deciding to call it a night and head home. As Mulugeta's friends were dropping him off, they had no idea they were all about to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, and especially the wrong color. Simultaneously, that same night, some young men and women who lived nearby Mulugeta in East Portland were also having a party. But unlike the Ethiopians who were sending off a friend's brother visiting the area, this party centered on something very heinous: white supremacy.
Ken Miske. I have no idea to pronounce this. I looked it up so many times. Miske? Ken Misk? Ken.
Miski, I think? I think Miski.
Yeah, our person Ken, who we do not like. Kyle Brewster and Steven Strasser, along with their girlfriends, Patty Kopp, Julie Bellick, and Heidi Martinson, were leaving their friend Nick Heisey's apartment when they bumped into the three Ethiopian men outside. At 23, 19, and 20 years old, respectively, Ken, Kyle, and Steve were members of East Side White Pride, a neo-Nazi skinhead group in Portland. So, who are the skinheads? Skinheads, sometimes just called skins, are members of an alternative subculture that typically revolves around their haircuts, which is, of course, for men, the shaven head, along with fashion styles and music subgenres. Skinhead culture actually has its roots among working-class youths in the UK who sought to rebel against austerity and conservatism.
I do often wonder if the Nazis actually stole the skinhead aesthetic or if some subset of the skinhead population evolved into Nazis. Like, is it a case of a group of entirely unrelated folks appropriating a subculture, or were elements of the subculture itself predisposed to radicalization? It actually reminds me of a movie. I don't know if you've watched it. This is England, which actually is a really good movie, and it explores like the sort of divide in British skinhead culture. And in the 80s, I believe, or the 90s.
I have not seen the film. I think it's been discussed before, but I am not well-versed in films at all. I know books and music, not films.
Yeah, we really complement each other really well because Erin is a master of books and music, and I, the lumpen prole, if you will, am a master of movies, shows, and video games.
Yeah. We each have our niche that we bring to the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure how the skinhead culture evolved, but some people definitely did appropriate the skinhead aesthetic for nefarious purposes, growing a new subculture of neo-Nazism around the original skinheads' avant-garde style. Notably, many skinheads and offshoot groups vehemently oppose racism. Think Dead Kennedys, Nazi Punks Fuck Off, or the group Sharp, Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. Nazis are kind of notorious for appropriating symbols like the swastika or the Celtic cross for racist purposes. They're not very creative people. Like, if actual fascists stole my aesthetic, which is like herbal tea and astrology memes, I would be so upset. I feel so bad for the original skinheads that fucking Nazis ripped off their look.
They're really not creative, but in a twisted sense, some of their symbology does make sense within its own internal logic, because fascism in general tends to build on this mythical image of a glorious past. So by claiming this past symbols, regardless of how accurate or not their view of history is, they're trying to harken back to, when things were great for our people, except, for the whole point that Celtic peoples or East Asians and South Asians weren't exactly considered people by Nazis.
I mean, it makes sense that people obsessed with cultural conservatism would hearken to the past to derive their aesthetics. I'm actually going to side with Adorno here and agree that aesthetics are a very crucial theater for the battle between oppression and resistance. But there are certainly neo-Nazi and white supremacist assemblages in North America and Europe who proudly consider themselves skinheads. Members of these organizations are pretty much universally anti-Semitic and, like the original Nazis, base their hatred for other groups like immigrants or LGBT people in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Since the 1980s, Portland has been an epicenter of skinhead racism. The state of Oregon was founded as a white settler colony, and, despite the progressive performativity spoofed in Portlandia, the Pacific Northwest has a strong undercurrent of white nationalism. Dozens of skinhead gangs have sprung up around Portland, including East Side White Pride, the group that Mulugeta Seraw's killers joined.
Not so fun a fact, up until 1926, it was technically illegal to be black in the state of Oregon. Like, just being black and being in the state of Oregon was against Oregon law. Well before its foundation as a state, the Provisional Government of Oregon enacted black exclusion laws in 1844 that prohibited black settlers from moving into the future state's borders. And violators of these laws were subject to whippings, the number of which depended on how long they were in Oregon before being arrested. And keep in mind that these laws were born out of fear that free black residents of Oregon would instigate a Native American uprising among the tribes that dwelled there. So they were afraid that black people and Native American people would, unite against these white colonists. And it says a lot that they banned slavery in Oregon, not because of some moral imperative, but the fear of, this uprising
Of
that
solidarity,
never happened.
yeah.
So from this fertile soil, the rotten plant of white supremacy in the Pacific Northwest really grows.
So let's talk about the perps of this crime. Who were Ken Miskey, Kyle Brewster, and Steven Strasser? Let's begin with Ken, the apparent ringleader of the group and the person who actually murdered Mulugeta Seraw with a baseball bat while Kyle and Steven helped.
Now, according to Eleanor Langer, Ken grew up in what some might call a broken home in the Pacific Northwest, spending some of his childhood in a group home. Throughout his life, he was violent to the people around him, including other children. He developed an interest in Nazism very early on.
Red flags. Misk became involved in drugs and the Portland death metal scene, rechristening himself Ken Death, which just... What an asshole. Yeah. From there, it wasn't a huge leap to racism, which was already present in the death metal subculture there. Misk's drug habit pushed him toward petty crime, which ended him up in prison a few times, where he was radicalized even more.
I feel like the criminalization of drugs, we've talked about it a lot before, but I feel like the criminalization of drugs is such a awful way of treating drugs. Obviously, we don't condone carceral punishment for drugs, but the fact that a drug habit is what started all of this, like in terms of the radicalization, says a lot about the war on drugs and how much of a failure it was.
Yeah. He didn't go to prison for telling people he wanted to be a Nazi. He went to prison for probably something to do with marijuana.
Yeah. Which shows you the priority of the state.
Right. And I think there's a point here too about how prison turned a guy that sounds like an insufferable racist edgelord with some psychosocial issues into a full-blown neo-Nazi. Prison is what radicalized him.
Yeah, exactly. Firstly, it's actually interesting how death metal consists of two extreme fan groups of fan subpopulations. Either you're like this radical anarchist communist or an outright neo-Nazi. There's no middle ground from all the death metal fans I've ever met. And as far as prison, it's not surprising because if you throw a resentful, bitter, alienated, and very violent youth into a pen filled with experienced neo-Nazis who inject him with some false pride, I want to say, about his heritage and give him some sort of purpose in life, what is to stop him from absorbing it? I mean, we've talked about this in our last episode, I believe. But in a way, radicalizing insufferable edgelords into actual neo-Nazis follows the same trajectory as educating people about anti-racism. It's basically evangelical proselytizing based around methods designed to empower the person you're talking to and make them feel, and I hate using these words, quote, seen and heard, end quote. Also, interestingly, the movie American History X, again, the resident movie expert of this podcast, and it's a great movie, I think, explores the role of prison in both radicalizing white young men. The movie itself shows this neo-Nazi who basically gets de-radicalized and evolving past his Nazism in a very, very touching and poignant way.
Like Ken, Kyle Brewster, another of Mulugeta's killers, also had a history of drug and alcohol abuse. He was a popular teenager and voted homecoming king at his high school. More disturbing, however, is that Brewster attended one of Portland's more integrated high schools, and he was an out and proud racist. I know we want to believe that open racists, just like any bad apples, are ostracized in our society, but the hard truth is that they really aren't.
I also think it's a point to make about the integrated high schools because often a lot of liberal solutions to racism is like, well, if we integrate things more, and I'm not saying it's against integration, but the idea that just, putting racists around people that they, like, of races that they hate will make them better is a very, very dangerous and false premise.
Yeah, also, people in schools, like in high school, are children and teenagers, and it's not their job to try to de-radicalize other teenagers.
Yeah, exactly.
Soon after graduation, Brewster drove deeper into the racist skinhead scene, covering himself in neo-Nazi tattoos. Among them were phrases like white power, right wing, and the South will rise again, along with traditional Nazi symbols like a swastika and a skull. Dude, you are from fucking Portland. The South will rise again.
Portland is as far away from the South as you could possibly get without being Seattle. Also, what is it with Nazis and skulls? It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you've seen the David Mitchell...
I have, yeah.
Yeah, the David Mitchell bit where he's like, our hats, they have skulls on them. Hans, are we the baddies?
Like, you'd have to know, though. You have to know if you are getting a tattoo of a swastika, what that means. Like, obviously.
Oh, of course, yeah.
The third killer was named Steven Strasser.
See, this is why we should never trust Strasserites on the left. Kidding. Well,
I agree with you.
Yeah.
He was described by those who knew him as a drifter and a follower, but that doesn't mean he was any less racist than Misk and Brewster. He would journal his encounters with Black people using slurs to describe them. Like, he would write down in his little book every time a Black person annoyed him, "Get some therapy, Steve."
Again, we come back to psychopaths documenting their crimes in personal diaries like, "Dear Diary, today I did a racism."
Yeah, like, I picture him sitting at his mom's kitchen table, just fucking seething, writing the most harebrained stuff. Like, "Dear Diary, today I thought I would treat myself to some delicious chicken nuggets. But when the Black woman in McDonald's handed me my order, she just said, 'Have a good one.' No, enjoy your meal. This is the curse of having white skin in this godforsaken multicultural dystopia." Also, maybe this is too harsh, but in the year of our Lord 2020, there are people who document every awkward or inconvenient interaction they have on Twitter and chalk it up to sex or race, orientation, etc. And all of these things do happen. We don't want to downplay that, but it's seriously not healthy. If you are journaling every perceived slight against you, it's really not a good sign.
Oh boy, you really touched a nerve for me here over this, in the sense that nothing pisses me off more than this sort of cowardly behavior where like an Uber driver is late by 5 minutes, or like a fucking like a Foodora or Uber Eats person like doesn't want to go all the way up to like a 20th floor where your apartment is. And suddenly it's like ableism and sexism, and he's malicious and he hates you because of your various identities and so on and so forth. And it's never done in a way where like they navigate the situation in a healthy way. It's always like this passive aggressive avoidance of conflict, and then they go on Twitter and make a thread about it, and then complain to the person's workplace to have them fired or whatever. It's very much like the leftist version of Karen. It's like Karen energy.
Yeah, not every time you are made uncomfortable or inconvenienced means that someone like hates you and is discriminating
Yeah.
against you. It's actually not usually that deep. It reminds me of the work of a sociologist named Matthew Huey, and he posits that a lot of times white nationalists and white self-proclaimed anti-racists actually essentialize race the same way. So both Steven Strasser and Robin DiAngelo, for instance, are hyper aware of their whiteness, but the former wears his skin color as a badge of pride, while the latter uses it to preach down to workers about race. And this isn't to say that race, class, sex, etc. don't prejudice some of our everyday interactions, or that colorblindness is a good thing, because it isn't. But there is a point where prefacing every interracial interaction with assumptions and stereotypes about all parties involved is unhelpful and frankly insufferable. It's like those men who claim to be feminists, but they somehow manage to make every interaction with a woman about gender, or they do this super weird soft boy song and dance when they want to ask you out. And it's like they don't see women as fully fledged people who can hold a normal conversation.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, honestly. A lot of red flags there.
Yeah, don't be a Steven Strasser.
Or a Strasserite in general.
Yeah. By the late 1980s, racists like Misk, Brewer, and Strasser were consolidating in groups like East Side White Pride and its sister organization, POWAR, an acronym for Preservation of the White American Race, which, if you have spelled it out in your head, it's like POWAR, not power. Nazis are not smart people. But yes, white women were then and have always been parts of these kinds of organizations. They were also often joined by a third group called the Youth of Hitler. Like, these guys are making zero effort to hide their ideas, but I want to take a second to note that just because other people wear suits and ties and don't name themselves after the Hitler Youth doesn't mean their ideas aren't equally dangerous. If anything, the contemporary white nationalist movement espouses the same ideas of racial separatism and the ethno-state, but puts a neater face on those ideas to obscure how grotesque they actually are. They try to make racism more palatable to those who want to consider themselves intellectuals rather than degenerates, and these are the people who end up in government. Exhibit A, racist vampire Stephen Miller.
Actually, noted neo-Nazi and famous punching bag Richard Spencer says this out loud. He talks at length about how today's white nationalists should wear suits and get these sort of clean haircuts and so on to market themselves better to the people. He's basically espousing a weird Nazi bastardization of the Maoist mass line theory.
As much as I despise Richard Spencer, I'm sickened to say that his PR method works for him.
Yeah, it adds respectability to their values, or to their core, at least, their appearances, if you will.
Right. And that's what you have to look out for, because the people like Misk, Brewer, and Strasser are the exception, and that they will say, yes, I'm a Nazi or a neo-Nazi, but most people won't admit it.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, Portland skinheads began forging connections with other racist groups in the region. One of these was Tom Metzger's White Aryan Resistance, or WAR, based out of California. War's vice president, a man named Dave Mazzella, even came up to Portland from California to distribute literature and hang out with people like Misk, Brewer, and Strasser in the weeks before the murder. Put a pin in this nugget of information because we'll come back to it later. So let's get back to our story. On the evening of November 12th, our neo-Nazi skinhead murderers were hanging out with their neo-Nazi skinhead friends, drinking and doing whatever it is they do, I assume talk about Hitler, while Mulugeta Seraw, Tilahun Entna, and Wanwosan Tesfaye were enjoying dinner with their friends. It sounds like the skinheads got themselves very drunk and worked up in their race hate, and the three Ethiopian men would walk right into a trap they had no idea existed.
Now, the actual case itself isn't really that complicated. Miska, Brewster, and Strasser wanted to pick a fight, and Mulugeta Seraw and his friends were immigrants and they were black, two things neo-Nazis definitely hate. So the skinheads screamed racial slurs at the Ethiopian men and then smashed their car window. And when Mulugeta tried to intervene, Brewster and Strasser kicked him while Miska bashed his head in with a baseball bat.
At first, this case struck me as a lynching because it has some similar characteristics, like the perpetrators being white and executing a black victim in the street. But often, white people performing lynchings would accuse their victim of committing some sort of bogus offense. The men who murdered Emmett Till claimed he flirted with a white woman. That's a well-known example. But also Leo Frank, a Jewish factory owner accused of killing a white worker named Mary Fagan. He probably didn't kill her, but it's another example of a lynching. But the skinheads didn't even fabricate a pretext for their violence. Mulugeta Seraw was there, and he was black, so they beat him to death. I think it's actually most similar to the 1993 murder of Stephen Lawrence in London. A gang of white guys just attacked a black person for no reason other than racism.
Yeah, and the investigation in this case was pretty straightforward. Tilahun Antna and Wanwosan Tesfaye had survived the attack, and they told police at the hospital that they had been assaulted by men with shaved heads, steel-toed boots, and Nazi tattoos who had shouted racial slurs at them. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that these people were skinheads. After that, it was pretty easy for the police to find a neo-Nazi who lived pretty much next to the scene of the murder named Nick Heise, and to start looking into his associates. At first, the killers and their girlfriends tried to lie about their whereabouts and their involvement in skinhead groups, but none of their stories added up. It was fairly easy to see they were lying. Steve Strasser and his girlfriend, Heidi Martinson, eventually began cooperating with the police, but Miska and Brewster resisted. But the evidence against them for the death of Mulugeta Seraw and the attacks on Antna and Tesfaye were really strong. I mean, one of the killers confessed and implicated the other two.
All three men pleaded guilty. For their part, Brewster and Strasser were convicted of manslaughter and assault, whereas Miski, the one who delivered the fatal blows, was convicted of first-degree murder and handed a life sentence. He admitted in court to killing Mulugeta Seraw because of his race. Ken Miska died in prison at the age of 45 of hepatitis C. He remained a skinhead his entire life and never expressed remorse for murdering Mulugeta. Kyle Brewster finished his sentence for manslaughter, but never disassociated from neo-Nazis and found himself back in prison for violating his parole by continuing to engage in white nationalist terrorism. Stephen Strasser defected from Nazism during his prison sentence, and his current whereabouts are unknown.
Interestingly enough, Miska was seen as a martyr among neo-Nazi groups, and in fact was frequently referred to by those groups as a prisoner of war up until his death in prison. And I think this point is remarkable insofar as it shows a major shift from the 90s neo-Nazi skinhead scene that basically saw itself as distinctly separate from and hostile towards the state, to the modern neo-Nazi movement that sees itself as an organ of the state insofar as it hopes to seize power from within, like we mentioned Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon.
What horrible people. Anyone that would look at this guy and see something to emulate, get some help, get some serious help.
Yeah.
I want to take a quick detour to talk about something that I don't think we really discuss enough, especially in the realm of true crime podcasts, which is the problems with incarceration. Don't get me wrong, I think Miski, Brewster, and Strasser are all despicable people who did a despicable thing, and they should be held accountable for that. In no way do I sympathize with these racist killers. The problem is, though, that when they're sent to prison, neo-Nazis form their own little gangs, like the Aryan Brotherhood, where they radicalize other white prisoners and terrorize the black prisoners. And we know that the criminal justice system in this country is biased against black men. So now you have situations where a young black man is incarcerated for something like a nonviolent drug offense, and he has to serve a prison sentence with actual Nazi murderers like Ken Miske, who are in prison for life for killing a black man and feel no remorse.
Yeah, and white supremacist gangs in prison are really, really violent. According to statistics from the FBI on the Aryan Brotherhood Wikipedia page, the group makes up less than 0.1% of the prison population, but is responsible for 18 to 25% of the murder in prison. So the problem with sending these guys to prison with everyone else is that in many cases it just doesn't rehabilitate them. It just radicalizes them further and puts other incarcerated people in danger.
I think one of the reservations we frequently have about prison abolitionism is like, then what are we supposed to do about racist maniacs like this? And I don't have all the answers, but incarcerating them alongside the people they claim to hate and want to kill definitely isn't the solution. In an ideal world, people would have intervened when these people were teenagers and started showing signs of racism and violence, and they never would have escalated to become murderers. But at some point, I think avowed neo-Nazis cannot be part of society. But we also just can't put them in human cages with the very people they want to genocide.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they're in prison and they're surrounded by, one, people of the races they despise, and two, more experienced and older sort of neo-Nazis that are more ideologically grounded, that's like a recipe for disaster. I don't think in any way, shape, or form people can be rehabilitated in that environment.
Yeah, and we are not sitting here and saying, like, let everyone go. There's no such thing as crime. Like,
Yeah.
definitely not. But we have to rethink, is the system doing what it is intended to do? And it is definitely not rehabilitating racists and preventing these people from committing further violence against Black people in prison.
Exactly. So the civil trial, with the three killers pleading guilty, that wasn't really the judicial end of the case. The Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League filed a civil suit on behalf of Mulugeta Seraw's father and his son Henrik against Tom and John Metziger.
Tom, you might remember, was in charge of the White Aryan Resistance hate group, and his son, John, was also involved in the group's activities. I have some serious reservations with the SPLC and especially the ADL, but I don't think this is the best episode to discuss them, nor do I believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, so the legal team representing Mulugeta's family, led by Morris Dees, essentially argued that the White Aryan Resistance and its leaders provoked an attack against Mulugeta by spreading propaganda that supported violence against Black people and immigrants.
In a classic, narcissistic, racist, zealot move, Tom Metzger decided to represent himself. It's always the assholes who want to represent themselves, Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Dylann Roof, and this guy, and he definitely wanted to use the trial as a platform to spread his racist views. But he's not a lawyer, and he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Morris Dees noted that Metzger thought that the first judge appointed to the trial was Jewish and demanded a new one, saying that a Jewish judge couldn't be impartial in the case because Metzger is an anti-Semite. So Metzger agreed that another judge, Judge Haggerty, could take the case, assuming Haggerty was Irish. But Judge Haggerty was Black.
But frankly, I'm surprised that he would have been okay with an Irish judge to begin with. Don't these people think the Irish are like papist subhumans as well?
No, I think in most white supremacist groups now in the United States, the Irish are considered white people. But what's so bizarre to me is how these self-proclaimed racists try to make themselves out to be victims. Like, oh, you are Jewish and I'm openly anti-Semitic. Therefore, you cannot give me an impartial trial because I am a victim of your bias. Like, that is truly depraved logic.
Yeah, and the Metzgers and war were found liable for the murder of Mulugeta in civil court under the doctrine of vicarious liability. Basically, the jury agreed with the plaintiff that the murderers were acting under the instruction of the White Aryan resistance, so war was responsible for damages. The Metzgers in war were ordered to pay around $12 million to Mulugeta's family, which they're still paying off to this day.
Metzger tried to use the free speech arguments typical of right-wingers, but free speech doesn't exactly work the same in a civil trial as it does in a criminal trial. There's a difference between the government incarcerating you for something you've said or written, and another person or group holding you responsible for violence provoked by your words. Things like libel, slander, and defamation, for instance, are considered torts. So, what has happened since the killing? Skinheads aren't as popular as they once were, but many cities around the United States, including Portland, have problems with white nationalist neo-fascist groups like Volksfront and the Proud Boys.
In May of 2017, for instance, a white supremacist in Portland named Jeremy Christian became enraged after seeing two black teenage girls sitting on a train just minding their own business, and ended up stabbing three people, killing two of them. And it's important to note that these two black teenage girls were literally not doing anything. They're like,
They were just
the train.
Sitting on a train.
Yeah.
Not that it would matter if they were like, I don't know, doing obnoxious things on trains, like playing loud music, which we all hate, but like, so?
Yeah.
Just put your headphones in.
Also, the people he ended up killing were not the black girls. They were bystanders who basically stood up for the black girls, I believe.
Yeah, tried to intervene.
Yeah, and he stabbed three of them.
Horrible. And the reporting on this case is so bizarre because, according to the Washington Post, Jeremy Christian, the stabber, is 6'1" and 235 pounds, or almost 150 kilograms or 17 stone for our international listeners. And part of the reason he committed this crime, again, according to the Washington Post, is because he was drunk after drinking about 35 ounces of sangria. That's like a pitcher of sangria. I am a 110-pound woman, and I could easily knock back a pitcher of sangria and like not even be that drunk. I would never drive a car or anything like that. But my friend and I used to each get a pitcher of sangria at this happy hour in Beirut all the time and drink the entire thing. And we were like not significantly impaired.
Yeah, he sounds like a one-shot wonder. Also, 150 kilograms is massive. Holy crap.
Right. So I frankly don't believe that he did this in a drunken rage, because I don't even believe he was drunk. I think he's extremely racist.
Yeah.
And like probably has some other issues as well, but
and also,
now
being
two people
drunk
are
doesn't
dead.
excuse anything. Like, I've been drunk before, and when I was drunk, my first thought wasn't like, oh my god, these teenagers on the streetcar or whatever are pissing me
right.
off. Go
I've
people.
been drunk and magically never committed a hate crime.
Yeah.
So, white supremacists around the country have killed plenty of people since 1988. The Overland Park Jewish Community Center shooting, the execution of 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, the vehicular homicide of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, the murder of 6 Jewish worshippers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the shooting of 24 people in an El Paso Walmart have just been in the past several years. That's 43 people right there, and those are only some publicized cases that immediately come to mind, and doesn't even count law enforcement homicides like the murder of George Floyd. I do want to end on a positive note. One of the Southern Poverty Law Center attorneys who represented Mulugeta Seraw's family in the civil suit ended up adopting his son Henok, and Henok studied political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is now a commercial airline pilot.
Yeah, go Henok.
Yeah. So we did want to make our episodes focusing on racial violence in the United States available for everyone, but we just wanted to tell you guys future bonus content will be on Patreon. We'll have a bonus episode this Wednesday that's available to everyone. No pressure or anything to donate to the Patreon, but we do appreciate the support, and it allows us to pay for our equipment, editing software, hosting platform, etc. So that's there. We are shifting our focus next month to a different sort of unofficial mini-series on ancient assassinations, so stay tuned for that. You guys know the usual drill. Subscribe, tell your friends. You can follow our socials at Das Criminal Pod. Any cases or topics that you want us to cover, just hit us up. We are pretty receptive to different ideas, and we can pretty much spin a radical angle out of anything because we are extremely critical little podcast twerps. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Until next time.
See you Wednesday.